And that standing firm requires a priestly calling.
Good morning, everybody. This is Jamie Souls. I'm here on the Chinook podcast with Brad Donovan, with Pastor Nathan Zekveld, and we're delighted once more to bring you a conversation together. We do have an excellent thing going on today. We have an interview with CREC's presiding minister, Brito, coming up. Yay. But before that happens, we are going to do some book reviews, but briefly. I think he's expecting a call right about...
in 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes. Okay.
Oh, brief.
My 1 minute book review.
Yeah, 1 minute for each of us.
1 minute book review. Let me commend to you for fictional reading. Read Ender's Game. If you've got teens or like older. Like 10 or 11 or above, the Ender's Game books, there's a whole great series of them. I think there's 19 books or something like that in the Ender verse is what they call it, that track with Ender, who was a genius kid in battle school out on a star. It's actually just really, really entertaining stuff. And if you want to get involved in a deep and long story, that's a really good place to go.
Sweet.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with Jamie on that. My book recommendation is a book called Is Church Membership Biblical? By Ryan M. McGraw and Ryan Speck. It's a 36-page book, so if you buy a copy of this book, you can buy it for under $4 on Kindle. It's really cheap, and it's just got a lot of really good, sound biblical argumentation, theological argumentation for why formal church vows and church membership are a biblical requirement.
Excellent.
So
okay,
yeah.
So and some people will look at that and they'll say, 36 pages? Come on.
Yeah, only 36.
He must not be reformed. It's not 360 pages.
Or else he's really reformed and he can condense things really, really well.
Brevity is the soul of wit.
And it's a sign of genius.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, genius hits the target no one else knew to aim for. So my book review is a much bigger book, Plato's Republic. I recently was going over it again in preparation for my next church history lecture, because Justin Martyr, in his first apology to the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius, refers to the Republic. So I went back and looked at some of its stuff, and I heartily recommend it to you. It's a good read, and you can see Justin Martyr's statements that Plato learned all his best stuff from Moses have some weight, both historically but also in terms of philosophy. So anyway, we are going to attempt a phone call?
Yeah, I think we are going to attempt a phone call. All right, Let's see what happens.
We are calling Florida right now.
Florida.
Yeah. So
Alberta calling Florida.
So if those of you who think we have a pope, he's actually Brazilian.
Stay on the line while your call is completed.
Okay.
Long-distance charges may apply.
That's a new one.
Oh, it's ringing.
There we go. Our eccentric form of interviews. Hello, Uri. This is Nathan Zekveld calling.
Nathan, how are you?
Good, and how are you? I've got Brad Donovan and Jamie Souls here for the interview.
All right, fantastic. Give me 1 second to put on my Bluetooth here. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I got 5 interviews today, so this is a good starter here.
Okay.
Awesome. What time is it in your house?
It is 9 o'clock right now, and I just got off a couple of counseling sessions. But I'm going to go all the way till 5 p.m. here. So
look at that.
Try to knock them all out in one day.
Okay.
So yeah, we're
with books, with book releases, and you get kind of a magical 30 days, and then everybody forgets about it.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's
right. And so You're riding the horse for all she's worth right now.
Exactly.
That's good.
And the hope is that even if people forget your book for 20 years after it's released, that they'll remember it 200 years after, right?
Amen.
Yeah. All right. So could you tell us a little bit about who you are for a minute for our listeners?
Yeah, I have been a pastor in Pensacola, Florida for 15 years now. I'm going to my 16th year, actually. And I have had the privilege of serving in the CREC for that long. And when I came to this congregation here in Pensacola, Florida, which for your listeners, this is the panhandle of Florida, extreme north part of Florida. When I came here, my only daughter at the time was 6 months old. Now we have 5 children now, and they've all grown up at Providence Church in Pensacola. And so it's one of the privileges that I've always share quite well is that they know the only thing they've ever known is our congregation. The only thing they've ever sung have been the psalms and hymns of our body. And so they're very enculturated in the life of our church.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great.
That's a blessing. All right. Well, I guess we'll start digging into the War of the Priesthood. I'll just begin with an initial question. Why did you write this book?
Well, there are a couple of reasons for writing the book. The first one was the desire to put a very familiar passage and bring the attention to that familiar passage from a different angle altogether. My suspicion was confirmed when I was researching this book that the majority position connects the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6 to a standard Roman soldier theme, so that Paul is essentially drawing a Roman soldier, maybe even from his prison cell. He's just observing the Roman soldier. He's just narrating step by step, armor piece by armor piece, what he's seeing. The area that really doesn't make sense, as I've continually have looked over this passage for many years, but very much in a focused area in the last 2 years, is that when Paul is critiquing and he is building the case for the armor of God, he's critiquing the schemes of the devil, which he places sort of squarely on the principalities and powers. It would be highly odd for the Apostle Paul to be building his armor on the basis of a representative of the principalities and powers. You know?
Yeah, that's good.
It just wouldn't make sense. He's trying to build a case for a holy empire, and to use someone who represents an unholy empire would be just odd to the apostle. So I wanted to present that image. And the second reason I wrote the book is because I really wanted to stress a hermeneutical point, an interpretive point that I think evangelical readers miss so often. And the reason they miss it is not intentional, but they miss it because there has been a concerted effort to divorce the Old and New Testament.
Yes.
And what I wanted to do with the book was essentially say, look, guys, the Apostle Paul has a primary language and he has a secondary language. And he uses the secondary language, but when he uses the secondary language, it's on the basis of his first language, which is Hebrew. So the Apostle Paul, his first language was always the Hebrew world, the Hebrew liturgy, the Jewish holiness code. And so the Apostle Paul was very steeped in that world, and it would be extremely unfortunate if we separated Paul from his first language.
Yeah.
Now, Paul addresses all sorts of contexts, all sorts of groups. I even believe he wrote Hebrews. And so he's addressing people from different angles, different perspectives, but he's always building his case from the thing that is most familiar to him, and that is the history of the Jewish world.
So you believe then that that the imagery that shows up in the armor of God passage is not drawn from the Roman soldier, but rather drawn from the Hebrew scriptures?
That's right. And there's a couple of things that I list in the book to make the case. But one element that I think we forget when we think about these conversations, and that's where the continuity element is so powerful in building the case I'm trying to make, is that the Bible is written in a priestly world. It's very hard for you not to read the Bible and not have a high ecclesiology. And I say that because virtually every pastoral epistle and letter is written to churches. So
Yes.
if you don't have a high ecclesiology, you're missing virtually the entirety of the New Testament. And by high ecclesiology, I am talking about what Peter talks about in 1 Peter 2, that God has made us to be, in some translations, a royal priesthood, and in other translations, it's sort of a similar word, a holy priesthood. I think both convey the same idea, and that we are made after a priesthood, and when we assume that this priesthood is something that comes ex nihilo, we're making a major mistake. The priesthood is built on a priesthood that has already been established.
Yes.
So we are in the continuity, we are in a lineage of priesthood. The major difference being that the priesthood that we now are a part of is a permanent priesthood, whereas the priesthood of the old covenant was a temporary and impermanent priesthood. So that the priests of the old established this theme of holiness, and the priests of the new live in this theme of holiness.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Uri, this is Brad Donovan. Just first off, I'd like to say I really have enjoyed reading this book. I'm going to make sure that my teenage daughter gets her hands on it when it comes out. I noticed that because you said this applies. Paul's applying the Old Testament to the New. So you're talking about the priestly garments in Exodus 28. Would you mind describing some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brett. And I think we're dealing with a kind of, and I'm sure you can say the same about Canada, but we're dealing with a high biblical illiteracy here. I live in a county that is one of the most saturated church counties in the country, maybe in the world, actually. There are 330 churches for 100,000 people.
Wow.
And I'm looking out my office window right now. There's a mega church there. There's a mega church across the street. There is just churches everywhere. It's a different world, I realize, than where you guys may be. But we live in the southern part of the United States. But even though, if you walk to any coffee shop in town, you're going to see people reading their Bibles, praying, study groups. That's a common image here where I live. But still, people have learned to think through the Bible through a very superficial way. And so they read the Bible more for proof testing than for building a kind of interpretive lens.
Yeah.
And Exodus 28, Exodus 29, Leviticus 8, Leviticus 9, these are not part of people's favorite Bible passages. I grant that point. This is not going to make anybody's life burn.
Yeah.
However,
Bible knowledge is a mile wide and an inch deep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful for your music, Jamie, because I think you bring a lot of this unknown world to the reality of day and day Christian reading and Christian existence. But the Exodus 28 passage and 29, you're dealing with things like, what is the chronology of the ordination of a priest? What are the elements that are part of this ordination? How does the priest prepare for this ordination? Why is there oil? Why is there washing? Why is he putting on the breastplate containing the 12 tribes of Israel? Why are there so many colors? These are all the kinds of things that need to be asked. And in a non-liturgical world, the one I live here in the South, they are not asked.
Yeah, no one thinks to ask those questions.
Exactly. No one does. But in our congregation, for example, we have the church calendar. So we're in the season of Lent right now. We're wearing purple. Well, purple is a very powerful priestly color. It speaks to royalty. It speaks to sacrificial living. And these are the kinds of questions that need to be asked. And so in the description of the ordination, the description of when God calls Aaron and his sons to be proclaimers of glory and beauty, well, that is a lovely description, because now you have to ask, what is glory in the context of priesthood? What is beauty? the Christian world, by and large, doesn't know how to deal with these categories except for a superficial way. But no, God was very interested that the details of the ordination of the priesthood would happen a certain way, because God was a God of precision. He was a God of beauty, a God of honor, a God who declared holiness to be his very name. So it was, just as a final note, it was very significant that the garments of the priest, and that would represent holiness. In fact, even the turban he wore would say, holy to the Lord, consecrated to the Lord, because as the priest went, as the priest taught, as the priest instructed, so went the people. And so if the priest was not sealed with holiness as markers throughout his body, the people would be led by the blind. It would be the blind leading the blind. So that's a little bit of synopsis of why I think those passages, even though they're foreign, should be very crucial to the alphabet of the Christian.
Yeah, we're engaged in a long and deep pursuit of biblical education for the church, where we learn to think like the Bible teaches us to think, where that scripture shapes us into what we ought to be, and the church really needs this, because she's very as you said, you may live in a Bible belt, and we don't really live in a Bible belt up here, but the fact is, it's still the case that the churches really don't have a good grasp on the scriptures, and they really need to. There's so much good food for the church in those scriptures that they pass over and say, oh, I don't understand it, and so therefore I'm not going to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, when we're talking even in Exodus 29 about the order of the consecration of the priests, right, the thing that strikes me is we start off with a bull and 2 ram sacrifice, and then a baptism, right? So the putting on of this priestly armor is preceded by sin being covered, by men being cleansed, and then we get to the garments of holiness, right? So I find that when you draw that forward into the Christian life and what Paul has to say about putting on the armor of God, it seems to me that Paul's just dragging Moses into the new covenant. That's really all he's doing.
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's great. So let me make this statement, which I know it would make a lot of Presbyterians concerned, but I will say it anyway. And I think this is the important thing. This is maybe the more controversial element of the book, has to be the description I have of the helmet of salvation. And I wanted to make that abundantly clear, because I think what you just described, I think, it's precisely what we see in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is tempted by the devil and our Lord, but before that, there's something very significant that happens. Mm-hmm. And we tend to disconnect Matthew 3 from Matthew 4, but the continuity is very crucial, because it ties into the priestly consecration order. And that is, the first thing that happens is Jesus is baptized by John the Forerunner. Yeah. And at that moment, we know the description very well. The curtains of heaven are open, and the Father comes and affirms the Son. And then he says, you are holy unto the Lord, and you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, which is another way of expressing a holiness language. You are consecrated for my cause, for my mission. Not that Jesus wasn't holy prior, but that now he's being, use my old Sunday school teacher's language, he's being holified for a particular mission. Well, you guys, I'm not talking to a foreign audience here. My Sunday school, I spent 3 years working with Jim Jordan here in Pensacola. Yeah. He always used the language of holify, which I thought it was great.
Yeah, we love that guy.
What happens, yeah, he's one of a kind for sure. And what happens is that when he is washed, he is sent out on a mission, the Spirit immediately pushes him to the wilderness. So if you were to think about and by the way, that particular world that Jesus lived in Matthew 4 is the exact world that the first Adam lived in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, specifically in Genesis 3, except Jesus doesn't have the same terrain advantage that Adam had. Adam had a perfect mountainous, green fields, sound of music kind of background, whereas Jesus
had a howling
gets
wilderness.
Hunger and thirst and howling wilderness, exactly. So Jesus is at an utter disadvantage, but he has something that's very significant, and that is the washing and the affirmation of the Father. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about this at another time. We can relate it, but the same three questions that the devil posed to Jesus in the wilderness were the same three questions the devil posed to Adam in the garden, except Jesus directs every single question to "It is written, it is written, it is written," from quotations from Deuteronomy chapter 8. So that baptism imagery is very significant because the priest is washed and baptized so that he can enter into a holy mission. And that's what happens to Jesus. And that's why Jesus brings, that's why the Apostle Paul brings that language in Galatians, I believe. For as many as have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ, have been clothed with Christ, have put on the armor of Christ. Mm-hmm. That language is exactly what happens. So I make the argument in the book that the helmet of salvation goes back to the priesthood, and that helmet is actually our baptisms that takes place, well, in our Reformed tradition, of course, in the infancy of our lives. So from the very infant stages of our life when we're baptized, from that moment, we are commissioned to serve in the mission of God to the world.
Oh, that's good.
Amen to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a quick question. So generally speaking, when I've looked at the baptism of Jesus, I've seen it as an anointing of Jesus Christ to be prophet, priest, and king. You seem to really draw on one element, but would you see it as all three, or primarily the baptism to be a priest?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an exhaustive answer to that question. I'll just give you a little sample of it. I think the three motifs are there. If we were, I'll build this into a larger context here. Let's just say that if I were to phrase it, the trajectory of history, I think God's people begin in a priestly era, which is the infancy of the life of the church. And then if you take to Jim Jordan's chronology, priestly, kingly, and prophet. I take it as, I differ a little bit, priestly, prophetic, and kingly. And I think the reason that's the case is because the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6 makes the use of language to stand firm, to stand up, to march. But the language of standing firm is a very significant language for the Apostle Paul, because I think that is the language that the royal priesthood that God has called to is supposed to embody. In other words, we are living in a stage of history, which I call it's the stage of standing up. And that standing firm requires a priestly calling. We may be transitioned in the next 500 years, I don't know, to a position where the church will have a very strong prophetic influence in history. And even though we priests proclaim truth, it's true, but we're not in a place in history right now where the prophetic stage is in its totality. And so that may move into a position as the world is Christianized. I think that's how things will move. But the final step of that is the kingly. And the kingly is, if you take Solomon's language, the kingly is a sitting down posture. Because now as kings, we make decisions on behalf, we rule over angels and principalities and powers. And so I think the kingly stage is when we're eternally seated with Christ in all his ascension glory. Now, there are various ways of phrasing that, but I think there's a centrality to priesthood in the New Testament, which is why the Apostle Paul in Romans 15 refers to his ministry to the Gentiles as a priestly duty. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting use of language there. The book of Hebrews uses the language of holiness and sacredness in connecting to the offerings of the Old Testament. And so I think if I were to sort of theologize over this issue, we live in the priestly stage of history still. We will move into the prophetic, and it will culminate in the second coming when we become true kings. Now, in every sense, we are all these things now, but they play out historically in different ways. That's sort of how I phrase that trajectory.
I really like that. That appeals to my understanding of the scripture as well. I like that. One thing I noticed, you addressed it in one of the chapters in your book, going back to the armor of God. You noted that there's no shoes in the temple service. In Exodus 28:29, there's no shoe described, but Paul here describes a shoe. Putting and shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. So I was wondering, so do you see a progression from the Old Testament priest to the New Testament putting on of the armor?
Yeah, great question. Great question. That is it's an eschatological element to, I think, the priesthood. That is I joke with my congregation here at Providence is that when you pick up, I'm staring at a host of systematic theologies that I've accumulated throughout my academic years. I have lots of them, but I have never found a chapter on human hair and human feet.
Come on, Dad.
Yeah. You need Jim Jordan for that.
Exactly. It just doesn't exist. I mean, I'm looking at it right now. However, the Bible loves to talk about, the human body parts.
Yeah.
And the feet is a very significant one. The place where you're standing is holy ground. Take your shoes off. Priests in the Old Testament function with naked feet. With naked feet, they could not withstand. They lived in some ways, under the tutelage of the first Adam. The procedural elements of the priesthood were so intensified because they were living under a failed priesthood. And even though there were glimpses of glory and beauty throughout the Old Testament, what I find fascinating is that the nakedness of the priesthood, in terms of their feet, is an indication that feet needed to be covered. And so the way I connect the dots is that the shoes, the shoes for the feet, ready to proclaim the gospel of peace, is that the priesthood of the Old Testament proclaimed peace, but what you find throughout the Old Testament are various expressions of peace. The people would say, peace, 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 but there is no peace. And so the priesthood of the Old Testament lived in this constant nudity, this constant inability to proclaim true and lasting peace. And however, there's some exceptions to this, of course, when the people are invited to the Passover meal, which is very interesting. They're called to put on their shoes, put on their shoes. And the imagery there, which I think is fascinating, and it also connects to, we all love Psalm 23, and we kind of view it as this sort of tender image of Jesus holding his sheep. But, what is Psalm 23 is actually a war psalm.
Yes.
And that the table is being prepared before the presence of my enemies because we're about to fight our enemies. And so the Passover description of the people putting their shoes on, it's almost a description of the armor as well, is God prepares the table for us, and we put our shoes on because we're marching forward because the enemy is around us, encompassing us. And in the new covenant, we see that the disciples are ready with the shoes on their feet. And we have the description in Matthew, which is really fascinating, where you remember when Jesus is sending out the 2x2 disciples, they go to a home, and if that home does not affirm the covenant God, their imperative is to dust off their feet, as if to say, this home is not marching with God. This home is going to continue to be naked. And I'm going to indicate with my feet that this home is under a curse. So in the new covenant, you have this now movement to permanency and eternality because the promises are now yes and amen. And in the Old Testament, they were no and perhaps.
or wait.
Or wait, exactly. Yeah. The promises were unfulfilled. They didn't have the permanent glory and beauty. So the people of God need to be covered, and that's a fulfillment of the nakedness of Adam.
Another question I had for you, Uri. I was reading through this passage for family worship the other night with my children, and it struck me that in Isaiah 59, God is described as wearing his armor, where it says he put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head, put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. So I'm just wondering what you think about God's wearing of his own armor.
Yeah, that's a great passage, and of course, that Isaiah 59 is a reference to sin, confession, redemption, all sorts of stuff. There is a separation that the people have from God Himself, and God's armor is a way of saying, "Look to me as your eternal refuge and strength." If you continue to walk in the nakedness of Adam, you'll be open. You'll be open, and you will be, the screw tapes of this world will have a feast with your body. They're going to devour you because the nakedness of Adam is sort of a simple evangelical way of saying, you're trying to do this by your own strength. And God says, look to my armor. Look to this image that I have. I'm your true protector. This is the eschatology you should shoot for. And one day, my son will be embodied with this armor, and united to him, you will have this armor. And so that's the language there is a language of union with Christ. To be united to Jesus is to have what he has, and to be united to God is to have what he has. And so the language of armor is a eschatological promise that God's people will all be armored up for war in a permanent way, not in a temporary fashion.
Excellent.
Yeah, there's stuff a little further along in Isaiah also about in 63. Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah, and who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength, that his eye speaking in righteousness, mighty to save? Well, why is your apparel red and your garments like he who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, he says, and from the people no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. There's this imagery of his garments again, but it's Christ. It's Christ trampling down the nations. He looks, and there's no one to help, and so he does it. And it's him in these clothes here in Isaiah.
Wow, that's a great text. I had not actually contemplated Isaiah 63, but it's a wonderful, I think, addition to this sort of resume of armory, because there is such a strong emphasis in the Bible on clothing, such a strong emphasis on putting on and putting off. And these are the kinds of things that I think will enrich our understanding. If the first evangelical premise is to go to some sort of Roman description, look at what happened in some Greek war, if that's our first instinct, what we're going to do is little by little we're going to be divorcing ourselves from that rich language that you just read. And I think the more we stay in Isaiah, the more we stay in the Old Testament, the more we have this liturgical continuity, the more grounded we're going to be. And we're going to see that the themes of the Bible sometimes are much richer than what we assume it to be.
Yeah, I've been rereading one of the church fathers recently, Justin Martyr, and that guy in several of his works, from memory, recounts most of the book of Isaiah. You could pretty much reconstruct Isaiah from that man arguing with either emperors or people that he was trying to evangelize. But if we could recover in our churches parking in the Old Testament, like you said. To learn about Jesus, we would do well.
Yeah, Jesus did say it was all about him.
He did. That's supposed to be our exegetical framework for the Old Testament is Jesus. I do have a question.
Right.
Yeah. Pardon?
No, I was going to add that that the element from I think it's Luke 24 of Jesus walking the road to Emmaus. That element, I think, accentuates much of what we need to think through, because we typically think, if you have just a little bit of a sophisticated overview of the Bible, we think we got promise and we got fulfillment, and that's it. The Old Testament promises were only for the sake of fulfillment. There's nothing else.
Yeah.
And if we only view it that way, what we're going to miss is that the substance of the promise is the only thing that makes sense now in the New Testament. It's the strength of the promise that guided and gave hope to the people. That the people knew that the fulfillment was going to come, but the promise, strengthened, renewed in covenant, was the thing that kept them marching towards the upward prize.
Excellent. So now we've talked about the armor generally. Is there anything specific you'd like to speak on about any of the specific parts of the armor, like the belt, breastplate? We've talked about shoes, but anything specifically that really stands out to you as something that is worthy of notice and maybe underappreciated in our modern exegesis? Is that even a word of
It
this
is
text?
now.
I just Jim Jordanized it. So, is there anything else that stands out to you as something that you really think we should understand and don't?
There is an element that I think it's important to note, and this falls under the category in theology of typology. And I think this is significant because there's always more than first meets the eye. The Holy Spirit doesn't waste his breath, and the fact that we can overlook the details of passages means that we're not really rooted in how the Bible establishes paradigms for thinking. That's unhealthy, of course. But this is now, I didn't get a chance to elaborate much in the book, but I'm just, as I thought through it, once you know how it is, right? Once you publish it, I should have added this here.
Yeah.
But there is
I should have said that.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said that, exactly. But there is a connection, of course, which I think is very crucial to the garden. And the garden is where all the magic happens. But beyond that, the garden is the model of history. Everything, every sin, every redemptive theme, every reconciliation, every war, everything can be traced back to the first three books of the Bible. I argue that there is a primacy to the belt of truth that is crucial for Paul's establishing of the armor of God. And I argue that the belt of truth correlates with the creation account, so that the belt of truth, especially in rabbinical literature, is interesting. Just as a footnote here, but in rabbinical literature, it says that the priest's sash was wrapped around his waist not once but several times, and so there was a clear attempt to fasten that thing, because if the sash was not properly fastened, I mean the priestly garments would fall. The same thing with the armor of God. Truth is the thing that secures the armor. Truth is the thing that secures the armor, and that parallels itself also to the first premise of creation, which is God creates light. Truth is the thing that illuminates humanity, that illuminates the world. But truth is also the thing that brings falsehood out of darkness. It reveals falsehood in dark places. And the priestly task is to move forward, fastened by truth, not just so he can proclaim truth, but that he would be able to discern between truth and falsehood. And that's where the second element of the armor comes in, the breastplate of righteousness, which is also quoted in Isaiah 59. The breastplate of righteousness is precisely that. It's the priest's ability to discern between good and evil. And truth is the thing that establishes that, because if there is no truth, John 17 says Jesus sanctifies us in truth, for his word is truth. If you lack that, then your discernment is going to be off. Your application of the sword of the Spirit is going to be off. Your proclamation of peace or the shoes of readiness, that's going to be off. So I think it's very intentional that the Apostle Paul establishes the belt of truth as the first of this rich armory description.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a very helpful way of looking at things. I did want to have you comment on one more thing before we start closing up this interview. I'm thinking about the pastoral angle of this book, and I'm thinking about if I had read it as a 16-year-old or 17-year-old or 18-year-old. There's a lot of tools in this book for fighting against sin, for spiritual warfare, for growing in wisdom. Like what would you say about this book from that angle?
Yeah, interesting enough, even though I had been working through the armor of God and sermons and things like that, I delivered 2 weeks worth of lectures in Moscow, Idaho last year to high schoolers.
Yeah,
and that was really interesting, because when I was talking about these things, I think in the past, I think it's very easy to look at the armor of God and say, okay, this pretty much means I have to read my Bible and pray every day, the end. However, if you look at each piece of the armor, there are distinct imperatives that come with it, especially if you connect it to the Old Testament priesthood. And among these imperatives are the imperatives to meditate on truth, to have a life of discernment, everything that young people in the church need, in your congregation, in my congregation, the kinds of things that tempt them, or the kinds of things that Paul was deeply familiar with. And so you have to have this, what I call baptismal consciousness that allows you to move forward in your walk and every day be, and here's an example of this. This is a misrepresentation, I think it's, that I point out in the book. When we talk about Luther's priesthood of all believers, evangelical readers will look at this and say, well, priesthood of all believers means I get to just read my Bible on my own, by my own, with, my favorite translation in my favorite closet with my favorite Jesus. And this kind of world, what it creates is sort of a self-appointed papacy.
Yeah.
But Luther's priesthood of the believers, which I think, my friend Jeff Myers has made it really abundantly clear in Luther's theology. The priesthood of the believers means we are priests unto one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if that's the case, then the 16-year-old in your congregation can only function as a priest if he's under the submission of elders and pastors. If he is in fellowship with other 16, but also other 2-year-olds and 79-year-olds, if he's in that community, if his priesthood is an isolated priesthood, that armor essentially is going to get really rusty, because the armor is only strengthened when we are renewed together, specifically, I argue, in covenant renewal worship on Sundays. And if our younger generation, let's say, if they take a very pietistic view of the armor, or if they take a nonchalant or an apathetic sort of approach to the armor, they're going to be very easily seduced. In other words, the temptations of the devil in the wilderness are going to be very appealing to them. Look, if you just do this for me, if you just sin this one time, I'll give you all these riches. I'll give you all this sort of this free lunch for eternity. And that is the enticement of our day, that the younger generation needs to be very self-aware that the armor of God is not merely a description for our individual piety, but it's an imperative to be with God's people and to know what time it is. And the time in which we live, has always been throughout history, but especially today, is a time when warfare is not the kind of thing that we have to pursue so much as The warfare is the kind of thing that comes to us. So be prepared, be armored up in season and in out of season.
Yeah, one of the things I find most challenging in this Ephesians 6 passage for myself is that Paul finishes off by talking about praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. So I remember I had a professor in Bible school many years ago, and he stood up at the front of the class and he said, "Class, I clearly don't actually believe in prayer." And we kind of looked at him and said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "Well, because if I did believe in prayer, in talking to God, I would do it differently." And I found that a challenging thought that stuck with me these past 20 odd years. So when I read Paul concluding this section talking about prayer, I immediately reflect on the importance of praying at all times, and it's a challenge to me to take up that discipline with more zeal.
Yeah, I understand that, and obviously I feel that in my own life at times, and I feel that as a father and as a pastor. There's always something to be, you always need to be in this healthy self-examination. That's significant. And I think what prayer does, and I argue this in the book as well, is that we need an elevation of speech when it comes to our prayer life. I think human beings are most comfortable with with mundane requests. And what I argue is we need a kind of elevation of speech. And what I simply mean by that is that we need to be more biblical in the way we think about prayer. That's why, of course, the Psalms are this rich genre of circumstances, because God was very self-aware of the stages of human life, of grief, of lamentation, of imprecation. And the question of prayer is one that is so common that's misunderstood. Like the armor of God, it's such a common description that it's misunderstood. And we tend to trivialize prayer. But what we should see, of course, that prayer is a thing that washes us anew, that renews us. And again, back to my earlier point, it is especially effective when we are with God's people, when we are engaged in the act of praying with God's people, because then at that moment, we are staring at each other's armors, we're staring at each other, and we're saying, just as you need renewal, I need renewal, so let's renew this thing together. Because we need the mutual encouragement, and we need the koinonia of the Spirit as a way of encouraging our hearts to move on, especially when things don't make sense around us.
Yeah. So when does your book get published? So when can people buy it, and where can people buy it?
All right, let me break the news to you. The book was published around 30 days ago.
Oh, okay.
And it was published through Noggin Nose Press, and I have a link that I can send it to you here. It's Noggin Nose, NOGGINNOSE, nogginnose.com. And if you go there, you'll see my book. I think it's the first one in the shop, and The War of the Priesthood has sold quite well. And I'm glad to know that it wasn't my mother that bought most of them. And we've had a good. I just got back from Moscow a couple of days ago, where I had an author's talk and book signing there at the Sword and Shovel bookstore there in Moscow, Idaho, which I know some of you know where that is.
Yeah.
And it was really good to see the interest of the people, but as was mentioned earlier, the interest of the younger people, the interest of the older people. Why? Well, because the armor of God is the kind of thing that's befitting for the infant and those who are at later stages of life. It's for all of life.
Yeah.
And that armor, by the way, that I argue in the War of the Priesthood is the armor that we will give to Jesus at the last day. And that's the armor that we'll present to him as a living sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So is there any social media platforms that you're on that you would recommend that people could come and, check out what you're saying and your more regular work on?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The place where I have focused most of my time these days, there's several ones. But the one I would draw your listeners to would be my Substack account. And that Substack account is DR for Dr. DR Brito, DRBRITO .substack.com. It's where I am posting daily Lenten devotionals now during Lent, but also I offer notations of books I'm reading, updates on my travels, updates on the books I'm writing, lectures, interviews, podcasts. That's drbrito.substack.com.
Oh, good.
And you also do a podcast called The Perspectivalist. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a really hard word to say, and I do this podcast as a sort of this is like reformed nerddom.
Oh, okay.
But I spent 4 years. I spent 4 years studying with one of my favorite people in the world, John Frame. When I was at RTS, he and I became very good friends. My wife taught with his wife, and his wife is still alive, and he has this developed idea in his systematic theology of the tri-perspectivalism. And that's always stuck with me because I think we look at the world perspectively, right? This is what makes the body what it is. Some are the feet, some are the hands. And so we need this mutual help in the church. And the Perspectivalist podcast is my way of sort of offering an angle about theological issues that may be just a little different, like the armor of God. But I think what it does, it enhances our conversations about a particular topic. So it's been a real successful. We just started season 5 with fresh new music. I have a really gifted musician here in town that provides the intro and outro music to the podcast. I think it's going to be a really enjoyable. We just, our last interview was with David Bonson, who was the son of Greg Bonson. He was here in town in Pensacola. I've worked with him for a few years. But I interviewed him on the topic of work, and so I have just a host of different topics coming up with you. And the Substack account also provides the link to the podcast as well.
Awesome. That's great.
Great. Uri, you serve as the presiding minister in the CREC. Our congregation up here in Grand Prairie, Alberta, we are part of the CREC. We have been interested in the last year and a half, where we're really starting to field questions from groups around Canada that are interested in starting up CREC churches. Can you talk to us just a little bit about that? Because I would expect that you probably get more of that than we do by far.
Yes, and I pass them all to my point man, Nathan, right there. Now, Nathan doesn't know it, but by default, he is the Archbishop of CREC Canada.
Oh, shoot.
I like it. We're getting him a pointy hat.
We're good. Yeah, you should. You should. Give him a nice hat. But I think that I think, this is the conversation you guys have in Canada is sort of people talk about Canada, they just kind of assume that it's this cohesive world. The same thing they do about my country in Brazil. You probably get this, I have a friend in Brazil. Have you ever met him?
That's right, yeah.
I have a Canadian friend who's never met him. Brazil's the 5th largest country in the world, and Canada is very large as well. But I think what you're seeing is the momentum that the CREC has sort of established, and for 25 years, but it's been a momentum that really picked up, of course, during the early COVID years, early 2020. And to be the kind of denomination, to be the kind of group, the tradition that can speak so cohesively about this, that Canadian churches did. We have very few in Brazil, but think about a socialist country like Brazil, and to take the position we did, well, that's got to call your attention. But what I like to tell people when I talk about the CREC is that we didn't just simply decide in 2020 to say, okay, guys, let's stand up to tyrants.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a decision made out of nothing.
No, that was in the DNA that made it happen.
Exactly, Jamie. That's exactly right. It was in the DNA. There was something particular about who we are and how we worship that allowed us to have this visibility that has really, grown and multiplied significantly. Yes, you're right. In my role as PMOC now, I probably get around 7 to 10 questions a week about starting CREC churches. And virtually every week, or maybe certainly at least once a month, there's someone in Canada that is showing a desire to start, which means that our work has become certainly internationalized, but our desire to challenge, as Paul says, principalities and powers and schemes of the devil are the kinds of things that are really becoming a prevailing theme in Canada when you have prime ministers who really shouldn't be in that position, but are acting as if they know what they're saying. And the common Canadian evangelical, as the common Brazilian evangelical, they're going to say, wait a minute, there is a word above all earthly powers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you're not it.
Yeah.
Yep. Amen.
God's authority is the highest.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on to this call. That was great to talk with you and to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
My absolute pleasure, guys. May the Lord bless your ministry and your work here at the podcast.
Yes, and
right.
you as well.
Thank you very much, Yuri.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, bye.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
And Yuri has left the building, metaphorically.
Yeah, so I would definitely strongly recommend that.
Get the book.
Apparently, it's already published, so get the book.
Yeah.
Buy it.
Yeah, I got the publication date wrong as well, but I get that kind of thing wrong all the
That
time.
happens now and then.
It does.
It's called The War
Of the Priest.
of the Priesthood.
Yes.
The War of the Priesthood, Yuri Brito. Look that up.
It's very much well worth reading.
It's not a huge book.
No, it's not. I think
No, it's under 150 pages.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's double spaced. It looks like it's pretty. It's a quick read.
yeah, it's not a big book, but it's got some big ideas. And I think that this is the kind of thing that if I had had this put in front of me when I was 16, like you were saying, Nathan, it would have been really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now that I'm 38,
Yeah.
like way too late, I get a good book to read.
Come on, 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
Grab a copy.
Yeah, no, this is good. I like it.
All right. Well, we are the Chinook Podcast, and today we did our interview with Yuri Brito. We commend this to you. If you are new to our circle, to this podcast, by all means, hit the subscribe button and listen in. We've got a whole bunch of episodes in our backlog already, and we've got many more to come. So it's a delight to be able to share conversations like this with you. So blessings to you all. I hope that you have an excellent day today.